The radio crackled to life in the control tower at Edwards Air Force Base, cutting through the morning stillness like a knife. Air traffic controller Mike Reynolds adjusted his headset and squinted at the radar screen, watching a single blip moving at impossible speeds across the desert sky. The aircraft had appeared out of nowhere, no flight plan, no identification, nothing but a ghost signature that shouldn't exist. Unknown aircraft, this is Edwards Tower, identify yourself immediately, Mike spoke into his microphone, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in air traffic control. The response came back clear and confident, a woman's voice that seemed to cut through the static like it owned the airwaves. Edwards Tower, this is requesting permission to land. Mike frowned. Something was off. The voice was too calm, too professional for someone flying without clearance into restricted airspace. Unknown aircraft, state your call sign and purpose. You are in violation of restricted airspace. There was a pause, just long enough for Mike to wonder if the transmission had been lost. Then, the voice returned, steady as before. Edwards Tower, call sign is classified. Request immediate landing clearance. The audacity of the response made Mike's blood pressure spike. In all his years of controlling air traffic, he had never encountered such blatant disregard for protocol. Military pilots, civilian pilots, even experimental test pilots followed the rules. Nobody, absolutely nobody, flew into Edwards without proper identification and clearance. Negative, unknown aircraft. You will identify yourself immediately or be escorted out of restricted airspace. This is your final warning. The radar blip continued its approach, maintaining a steady course toward the main runway. Mike reached for the emergency phone to scramble interceptors when Colonel James Morrison burst through the control tower door, his face flushed from running up 3 flights of stairs. Reynolds, what's the situation? Morrison demanded, his eyes immediately going to the radar screen. Unknown aircraft, sir. Refuses to identify, requesting landing clearance. Speed and altitude suggest it's military, but we have no record of any scheduled flights. Morrison grabbed a spare headset and plugged it in. Unknown aircraft, this is Colonel Morrison, base commander. You will identify yourself immediately or face military intervention. The response came back without hesitation. Colonel Morrison, I have clearance from General Patterson. Check your secure channels. Morrison's face went pale. General Patterson commanded the entire test wing, and his clearances were not questioned lightly. But something about this entire situation felt wrong. Stand by, Morrison said into the radio, then turned to his aide. Get me General Patterson on the secure line, now. While they waited, Mike watched the mysterious aircraft continue its approach. The pilot was flying with precision that bordered on the supernatural, maintaining perfect alignment with the runway despite the crosswinds that had grounded lesser pilots that morning. Whoever was flying that aircraft knew what they were doing. The phone rang, and Morrison snatched it up. General, sir, we have an unidentified aircraft requesting landing clearance. Pilot claims to have your authorization. The conversation that followed was brief and entirely one-sided. Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to surprise to something approaching awe. When he hung up the phone, his hands were shaking slightly. Clear the aircraft for landing, Morrison said quietly. Full emergency protocol. Clear all personnel from the tarmac except essential ground crew. Mike stared at his commander. Sir, what about identification? The pilot will identify upon landing. That's a direct order from General Patterson himself. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as the mysterious aircraft made its final approach. Through the tower's large windows, Mike could see it clearly for the first time. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, a sleek, angular craft that seemed to shimmer in the desert heat. The design was clearly military, but it belonged to no aircraft in any manual he knew. The landing was flawless, the aircraft touching down with barely a whisper of tire smoke. As it taxied toward the designated parking area, ground crews emerged from their hiding spots, their faces masks of professional curiosity mixed with poorly concealed excitement. Colonel Morrison was already heading for the elevator when Mike called after him. Sir, shouldn't someone stay on the radio? Transfer all traffic to auxiliary control, Morrison replied without looking back. I want to meet this pilot face to face. By the time Morrison reached the tarmac, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Word had spread quickly through the base, as it always did when something unusual happened. Test pilots, mechanics, and support personnel all found reasons to be in the vicinity, their eyes fixed on the strange aircraft that sat cooling in the desert sun. The canopy remained closed for several long minutes, adding to the tension that hung in the air like the heat waves rising from the concrete. Then, with a soft hydraulic hiss, it began to open. The figure that emerged was not what anyone expected. She was tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. Her flight suit bore no insignia, no name tag, no indication of rank or service branch. But it was her face that drew attention, sharp and intelligent, with eyes that seemed to take in everything around her in a single glance. She removed her helmet, revealing short-cropped auburn hair and a face that might have been called beautiful if not for the hard edge that came from years of pushing the boundaries of what was possible. She was young, maybe early 30s, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen more than her years suggested. Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his curiosity overriding military protocol. I'm Colonel Morrison, base commander. General Patterson said you had clearance, but he didn't mention your name or unit. The woman's smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing. Colonel Morrison, thank you for the landing clearance. I'm afraid my identity is classified above your clearance level. The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. In 30 years of military service, he had never encountered someone whose classification was above his own. As base commander of Edwards, he had clearance for virtually every black project that flew. That's impossible, Morrison said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. I have top secret clearance for all projects operating out of this base. Not this one, the woman replied simply. She reached into her flight suit and produced a sealed envelope bearing the insignia of the Pentagon's most classified programs. General Patterson asked me to give you this. It should explain everything you're cleared to know. Morrison took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. He tore it open and read the contents, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement to something approaching fear. When he finished, he looked up at the woman with new respect. I apologize for the confusion. Your clearance checks out. Morrison paused, studying her face. But, I still don't understand. Who are you? The woman glanced around at the assembled crowd, noting the dozens of faces watching their every move. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Colonel. Morrison nodded and gestured toward the base headquarters building. As they walked across the tarmac, he couldn't help but steal glances at the mysterious aircraft. Even up close, it defied easy categorization. The lines were too clean, the materials too advanced, the entire design too far ahead of anything he knew was in development. What do you call that aircraft? Morrison asked as they reached the building. The woman paused at the entrance, her hand on the door. For the first time since landing, she seemed to hesitate, as if weighing her words carefully. That depends on who's asking, she said finally. But most people who know about it call it the Phantom. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard whispers of the Phantom program, rumors that circulated in the darkest corners of the military-industrial complex. Stories of an aircraft so advanced, so classified, that its very existence was denied by everyone who might know about it. The Phantom is just a legend, Morrison said, though his voice carried little conviction. The woman's smile returned, cold and enigmatic. Is it, Colonel? Then, what just landed on your runway? As they entered the building, neither of them noticed the young airman who had been watching from behind a nearby hangar. Technical Sergeant David Chen had seen the entire exchange, and his mind was racing with possibilities. He had been assigned to Edwards for only 6 months, but he had already heard the stories about the Phantom program. Chen was not just any airman. He was a computer specialist with a talent for finding information that others preferred to keep hidden. His unofficial hobby was tracking down the truth behind the various black projects that operated out of Edwards, and he had developed a network of contacts throughout the military-industrial complex. As the mysterious woman and Colonel Morrison disappeared into the headquarters building, Chen made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his secure phone and sent a carefully worded message to his contact at the Pentagon, a civilian contractor who had access to classification databases. The message was simple: need background check on female pilot, call sign unknown, flew in this morning on classified aircraft. Extremely high clearance level. Need to know who she is. The response came back within minutes: negative on background check. No female pilots currently assigned to classified flight programs. Are you certain of your information? Chen stared at his phone in disbelief. According to official records, the woman who had just landed at Edwards Air Force Base didn't exist. The aircraft she flew was supposed to be a myth. And yet, she was here, speaking with the base commander as if she owned the place. For the first time in his career, Technical Sergeant Chen found himself face to face with something that the military's vast bureaucracy couldn't explain. And he knew, with a certainty that came from years of digging into classified programs, that he had stumbled onto something that would make or break careers. Inside the headquarters building, Colonel Morrison led the mysterious woman to his private office, carefully closing the door behind them. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, but she remained standing, her posture alerting him that this conversation would not be a comfortable one. The letter from General Patterson explains your clearance, Morrison began, settling into his own chair. But it raises more questions than it answers. According to my records, the Phantom program was terminated 5 years ago. The woman's expression didn't change. Your records are incomplete, Colonel. Then, enlighten me. What exactly is the Phantom program, and why is it operating out of my base without my knowledge? For a long moment, the woman said nothing, her gaze moving around Morrison's office, taking in the commendations on the walls, the photographs of aircraft he had flown, the evidence of a distinguished career in military aviation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Morrison hadn't noticed before. Colonel Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that most people in the military don't even know exist. The Phantom program isn't just about aircraft development. It's about pushing the boundaries of what's possible in aerospace technology, often in ways that challenge our understanding of physics itself. Morrison felt his mouth go dry. You're talking about experimental propulsion systems. Among other things. The woman moved to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched to the horizon. The aircraft you saw today represents technology that won't appear in conventional military applications for decades, if ever. But its development is critical to maintaining strategic advantages in an increasingly complex world. And you're the test pilot for this program? The woman turned back to face Morrison, and, for the first time, he saw something approaching vulnerability in her expression. I'm more than just a test pilot, Colonel. I'm the program. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had just heard. In 30 years of military service, he thought he had seen everything the military-industrial complex could produce, but this woman was something entirely different. You're the program, Morrison repeated slowly. What exactly does that mean? The woman moved away from the window and took the chair across from his desk for the first time. As she settled into the seat, Morrison noticed details he had missed before. Her movements were too precise, too controlled, as if every gesture was calculated for maximum efficiency. Her eyes seemed to take in everything at once, processing information at a speed that was almost unsettling. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, she said, and Morrison immediately noticed that she shared a surname with the young airman he had seen around the base. Though that identity exists only in the most classified databases. For operational purposes, I don't exist at all. Chen? Morrison asked. Any relation to Technical Sergeant David Chen? Sarah's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. David is my younger brother. He doesn't know about my real assignment. Morrison filed that information away for later consideration. Continue. The Phantom program began 12 years ago as a joint project between the Air Force, DARPA, and several private contractors. The initial goal was simple: develop an aircraft capable of reconnaissance missions in hostile airspace where conventional aircraft would be detected and destroyed. Morrison nodded. That doesn't sound particularly revolutionary. We've been developing stealth technology for decades. The difference, Sarah continued, is that conventional stealth technology relies on minimizing radar signatures and heat signatures. The Phantom program took a different approach. We developed technology that makes aircraft effectively invisible to all forms of detection. Impossible, Morrison said immediately. There's no material science that could achieve true invisibility. Sarah's smile was thin and humorless. You're thinking in terms of conventional physics, Colonel. The Phantom program operates beyond those limitations. She reached into her flight suit and produced a small device that looked like a modified tablet computer. This contains technical specifications for the Phantom aircraft, classified at levels that require special authorization even to view. But, I'm authorized to share certain basic principles with you. Morrison took the device, noting that it required both a fingerprint scan and a retinal scan before it would activate. When the screen finally came to life, what he saw made his blood run cold. The technical readouts were unlike anything in his experience. Propulsion systems that seemed to violate conservation of energy. Materials that bent light around them like water around a stone. Computer systems that processed information at quantum speeds. This is science fiction, Morrison whispered, though even as he said it, he knew he was looking at something very real. 12 years ago, it was science fiction, Sarah agreed. Today, it's science fact. And, I'm the only pilot qualified to fly it. Morrison looked up from the screen to study Sarah's face. How is that possible? This level of technology would require years of training, specialized knowledge that doesn't exist in any curriculum. Because I wasn't trained to fly the Phantom, Colonel. I was designed for it. The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. He set the tablet down carefully, his hands suddenly unsteady. Designed? Sarah's expression remained calm, but Morrison could see something deeper in her eyes now, something that might have been pain or regret or simple acceptance of an impossible truth. The Phantom program faced a critical problem early in development, she explained. The aircraft's capabilities exceeded human limitations. No conventional pilot could handle the stresses, the processing requirements, the split-second decisions required to operate the systems effectively. Morrison felt his mouth go dry. So you developed enhanced pilots. I was the prototype, Sarah said simply. Genetically modified from birth, trained from childhood, augmented with technologies that most people can't imagine. I'm not entirely human anymore, Colonel. But, I'm the only person alive who can fly the Phantom. The office fell silent except for the distant sound of aircraft operations continuing outside. Morrison stared at the woman across from his desk, trying to reconcile what she was telling him with everything he thought he knew about the world. How many others know about this, he finally asked. Fewer than 50 people worldwide have full knowledge of the Phantom program, Sarah replied. Most of them are in the highest levels of government and military command. The rest are scientists and engineers who develop specific components without understanding the complete picture. Morrison thought about the implications. And, your brother? David? David suspects something unusual is happening here at Edwards, but he doesn't know about the Phantom program specifically. His computer skills make him potentially dangerous to operational security, which is why I chose to land here today. You chose to land here because your brother is stationed here? Sarah shook her head. I chose to land here because David has been asking questions. His research into classified programs has attracted attention from people who would prefer those questions remain unanswered. Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What kind of attention? The kind that ends careers and, sometimes lives, Sarah said bluntly. David's curiosity has made him a target. I'm here to protect him. Before Morrison could respond, his secure phone rang. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded permission for him to answer. Morrison. Colonel, this is General Patterson. I need you to provide full support to our visitor. Whatever she needs, whatever she asks for,
consider it a direct order from the Joint Chiefs.
Yes, sir.
General, can you tell me anything more about the nature of this visit?
There was a pause on the other end of the line.
Colonel, what you're dealing with represents the future of American air superiority.
Treat it accordingly. The line went dead, leaving Morrison staring at the phone. He looked up to find Sarah watching him with an expression that might have been sympathy.
General Patterson doesn't know the full truth about the program, Sarah said.
Very few people do. But he knows enough to understand the implications. Morrison set the phone down carefully.
What exactly are the implications? The Phantom represents a technological advantage that could determine the outcome of future conflicts.
But it also represents risks that most people aren't equipped to understand.
That's why the program operates in absolute secrecy.
What kind of risks? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze turning toward the window where her aircraft sat cooling in the desert heat. The technology that makes the Phantom possible doesn't just bend the laws of physics, Colonel.
It breaks them.
And, when you break the fundamental rules that govern reality, you never know what might break in return. Morrison followed her gaze to the aircraft outside. Even from this distance, it seemed to shimmer in the heat, as if it existed slightly outside normal space and time.
Are you saying the aircraft is dangerous?
I'm saying that any technology advanced enough to seem impossible carries inherent risks. The Phantom program has taken precautions, but we're operating in uncharted territory. A soft knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. Morrison called for the visitor to enter, and Technical Sergeant David Chen stepped into the room. He stopped short when he saw Sarah, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to confusion to something approaching recognition. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption," David said, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "But I have urgent intelligence regarding the aircraft that landed this morning."
Morrison glanced at Sarah, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "What intelligence, Sergeant?" David's gaze flicked between Morrison and Sarah before settling on his commanding officer.
"Sir, I've been monitoring communications regarding the aircraft. There are indications that its arrival has been detected by foreign intelligence services." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Morrison leaned forward in his chair.
"What kind of indications?"
"Increased satellite surveillance over Edwards, unusual communication patterns between known intelligence operatives, and, most concerning, at least 3 private aircraft have filed flight plans that will bring them into the vicinity of the base in the next 6 hours. Sarah stood up abruptly, her movements so sudden that both men automatically stepped back. "David," she said quietly, and Morrison could hear something in her voice that hadn't been there before.
"How long have you been monitoring these communications?"
David's expression shifted as he really looked at his sister for the first time in 3 years. The family resemblance was undeniable now that they were in the same room, but there was something different about her, something that went beyond the passage of time.
"Sarah?"
David whispered.
"What are you doing here? What happened to you?"
The reunion Morrison was witnessing was unlike anything he had ever seen. There was joy in David's face, but it was mixed with confusion and a growing sense that his sister had become someone he no longer recognized. "I can't explain everything right now," Sarah said, moving toward her brother with the same controlled precision that characterized all her movements. "But you need to know that you're in danger. Your research into classified programs has attracted the wrong kind of attention." David's face paled.
"How do you know about my research?"
"Because I'm part of one of the programs you've been investigating," Sarah replied simply. "And the people who run these programs don't like having their secrets exposed." Morrison watched the exchange with growing unease. The family drama unfolding in his office was complicated enough, but the intelligence about foreign surveillance added a layer of immediate danger that he couldn't ignore.
"Sergeant Chen," Morrison said, interrupting the reunion. "What's your assessment of the threat level?"
David reluctantly turned his attention back to his commanding officer, though his eyes kept drifting to his sister.
"Hi, sir."
The pattern of surveillance suggests a coordinated intelligence operation. Someone knows about the aircraft and wants to learn more about its capabilities. Sarah moved to the window, her gaze scanning the sky with an intensity that made Morrison nervous.
"They're not just interested in the aircraft," she said. "They're interested in me." "Why you specifically?" Morrison asked.
Sarah turned back to face them, and Morrison saw something in her expression that chilled him to the bone. It was the look of someone who had spent years being hunted and had finally been found.
"Because I'm not the first pilot in the Phantom program," Sarah said quietly. "I'm the only one left alive."
The silence that followed Sarah's words was deafening.
Colonel Morrison felt the weight of implications settling around them like a heavy fog.
David stared at his sister with growing horror, finally, beginning to understand that whatever had happened to her during their years apart had transformed her into something he barely recognized. "The only one left alive," Morrison repeated slowly.
"How many others were there?"
Sarah moved away from the window, her posture shifting into something that resembled a defensive stance. "The Phantom program created 7 enhanced pilots over a period of 8 years. I was the most recent, and, apparently, the most successful."
"What happened to the others?"
David asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
3 died during the enhancement process.
The human body isn't designed to handle the modifications required for Phantom operations.
2 others died in training accidents, though we later determined that the accidents weren't accidental."
Morrison felt his blood run cold.
"Sabotage?" "Foreign intelligence services have been aware of the Phantom program for years, even though they don't understand its full capabilities. They've made multiple attempts to steal the technology or eliminate the pilots who can operate it."
David was shaking his head slowly, as if trying to reject what he was hearing.
"Sarah, this is insane."
"You're talking about genetic modification, assassination, technology that shouldn't exist." "David," Sarah said gently, though her eyes remained alert for any sign of external threat. "You've been investigating classified programs for months.
Did you really think they were all conventional aircraft development?"
Before David could answer, Morrison's secure phone rang again.
He glanced at the caller ID and felt his stomach drop.
The call was coming from NORAD.
"Morrison."
"Colonel, this is General Hayes at NORAD. We have a situation developing in your airspace. 3 aircraft approaching Edwards Air Force Base, flying in formation, no flight plans, no radio contact." Morrison looked at Sarah and David, seeing his own dread reflected in their faces.
"What's their ETA?" 12 minutes.
"Colonel, we're scrambling interceptors, but I need to know the status of the classified aircraft that landed at your facility this morning."
Morrison hesitated, unsure how much he was authorized to reveal. Sarah stepped forward and gestured for the phone.
Morrison handed it to her without question.
"General Hayes, this is Phantom 1. I'm assuming command of the situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Phantom 1, we have no record of that call sign in our systems. Check classification level 7 Alpha. You should find authorization for full operational control."
The pause stretched longer this time. When General Hayes came back on the line, his voice carried a new level of respect and concern.
"Phantom 1, you have full authorization."
"What are your orders?"
Sarah's transformation was immediate and startling.
The woman who had been speaking gently to her brother moments before was gone, replaced by someone who radiated command authority.
"General, those incoming aircraft represent hostile intelligence gathering.
Do not engage directly. I need a clear flight path for immediate departure from Edwards."
"Understood. Clear flight path will be established in 2 minutes."
Sarah handed the phone back to Morrison and moved toward the door. "Colonel, I need to reach my aircraft immediately."
"David, you're coming with me." David stepped back instinctively.
"I'm not going anywhere until you explain what's happening." Sarah stopped and turned to face her brother, and Morrison saw something in her expression that made him understand why she was the last Phantom pilot alive. It was the look of someone who had survived when others hadn't because she was willing to do whatever was necessary. "David, the people in those aircraft are here because of your research. They've identified you as someone with access to classified information, and they intend to extract that information by any means necessary.
But I don't know anything about your program. They don't know that, Sarah said simply. And they won't take your word for it.
Morrison stood up from his desk, his military instincts finally overriding his shock at the situation.
What do you need from base security? Clear the area around my aircraft. No personnel within 50 meters.
And, Colonel, once we depart, deny that any of this ever happened.
As they left Morrison's office, the base's alert sirens began to sound.
Through the windows, Morrison could see personnel scrambling to secure equipment and take defensive positions.
The peaceful morning at Edwards Air Force Base was rapidly turning into a war zone.
They reached the tarmac just as the first of the incoming aircraft became visible on the horizon. Sarah moved toward the Phantom with the fluid grace Morrison had noticed earlier, but now he understood that it wasn't just confidence. It was the result of genetic modifications that had optimized her entire body for combat situations.
David, get in, Sarah called, the Phantom's canopy sliding open with a soft hydraulic hiss.
David hesitated at the base of the aircraft.
Sarah, I can't just leave. This is my assignment. These are my responsibilities.
Sarah was already climbing into the pilot's seat, her hands moving over controls that seemed to respond to her touch before she even reached them.
Your responsibility right now is to stay alive. Get in the aircraft.
The approaching formation was closer now, and Morrison could see that they were military-style aircraft, though not of any design he recognized. Through his binoculars, he could make out what appeared to be weapons systems mounted on their wings.
Phantom 1, this is NORAD.
Incoming aircraft are armed and have failed to respond to radio contact.
Recommend immediate evasive action.
Sarah's voice came through Morrison's radio with crystalline clarity.
NORAD, understood. Beginning evasive maneuvers.
David was still standing beside the aircraft, torn between loyalty to his sister and his duty to the base. The decision was made for him when the lead aircraft in the approaching formation suddenly accelerated, diving toward the base at a speed that defied everything Morrison knew about aircraft performance.
David, now! Sarah shouted. David scrambled up the side of the aircraft and dropped into the rear seat just as Sarah activated the Phantom systems.
The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The aircraft seemed to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent and, then, disappearing entirely from visual sight. Morrison watched in amazement as his instruments detected the Phantom's departure even though his eyes could see nothing. The aircraft was there, moving at incredible speed, but it existed somehow outside normal visual spectrum.
The attacking aircraft reached Edwards just as the Phantom cleared the runway.
What followed was unlike any aerial combat Morrison had ever witnessed, even in his years as a test pilot. The enemy aircraft seemed to be firing at empty air, their weapons systems unable to lock onto a target they couldn't detect.
But Sarah was doing more than simply evading.
Through his radio, Morrison could hear her coordinating with NORAD, providing targeting information for the interceptor aircraft that were now engaging the hostile formation. NORAD, hostile aircraft are using adaptive camouflage systems, but they're vulnerable to thermal imaging at these coordinates. Morrison watched as American interceptors arrived and engaged the enemy aircraft with precision that suggested they were receiving real-time targeting data from someone with perfect situational awareness. The aerial battle lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 2 of the 3 attacking aircraft had been destroyed, and the third was fleeing toward international airspace, trailing smoke from damaged engines.
Sarah's voice came over Morrison's radio one final time. Edwards Tower, this is Phantom 1. Threat neutralized. Returning to operational status. Phantom 1, where are you returning to? Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Edwards Tower, that information is classified. Phantom 1, out.
Morrison stood on the tarmac for a long time after the radio went silent, staring up at the empty sky where one of the most advanced aircraft in the world had disappeared with 2 passengers whose lives had just been forever changed.
The cleanup began immediately.
Military personnel swarmed over the debris from the destroyed aircraft, collecting every piece of evidence that might reveal the identity or origin of the attackers. Morrison knew that within hours, all traces of the morning's events would be classified and filed away in archives that most people would never know existed.
Technical Sergeant David Chen's replacement arrived the next morning with orders transferring him to a classified assignment. The official story was that David had been selected for specialized training that would keep him away from Edwards for an indefinite period. Morrison never saw Sarah Chen again, though he sometimes caught glimpses of aircraft on his radar screens that moved in ways that conventional physics said were impossible. He learned not to ask questions about those contacts, and his controllers learned not to report them. 6 months later, Morrison received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph showing David and Sarah standing in front of an aircraft hangar somewhere that looked like it might be underground. They were both wearing flight suits with no insignia, and David looked like he had gained 20 pounds of muscle and lost 10 years of stress. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single word in careful handwriting: safe. Morrison kept the photograph in his desk drawer, next to the classified tablet Sarah had shown him that day. Both served as reminders that the world contained mysteries far beyond anything he had imagined during his years of military service. The official reports from that morning at Edwards Air Force Base made no mention of the Phantom aircraft or its pilot. They described a training exercise that had been interrupted by unidentified aircraft of unknown origin, which had been successfully repelled by base defensive systems. But Morrison knew the truth. He had witnessed the future of warfare, embodied in a woman who was no longer entirely human and an aircraft that operated beyond the boundaries of known science. He had seen the price of that advancement in the loneliness that haunted Sarah's eyes and the confusion that had filled her brother's face. More importantly, he had seen the dedication that drove people to sacrifice their humanity for the greater good, and the love that made those sacrifices worthwhile. The Phantom program continued its operations in absolute secrecy, and Morrison never spoke of what he had witnessed that morning. But he never forgot the moment when Sarah Chen had looked him in the eye and identified herself by a call sign that had turned his understanding of the possible upside down. Years later, when Morrison retired from active duty, he would sometimes tell people that the most remarkable thing about his career wasn't the experimental aircraft he had flown or the classified programs he had overseen. It was the day he met someone who had sacrificed everything to become something the world needed, even if the world would never know she existed. 3 years after the incident at Edwards Air Force Base, Colonel Morrison had been promoted to general and transferred to the Pentagon, where his new position gave him access to intelligence reports that most military officers would never see. It was in one of these reports that he first learned the full truth about what had happened that morning when Sarah Chen landed her impossible aircraft on his runway. The report was classified at levels that required special authorization even to read, and Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he opened the file marked Phantom Operations, Final Assessment. What he found inside challenged everything he thought he understood about the program that had briefly intersected with his career. Sarah Chen had not been the 7th pilot in the Phantom program. She had been the only pilot. The other 6 pilots had been fabricated identities, created to conceal the true nature of the program from everyone except a handful of people at the highest levels of government. The Phantom program had never been about creating enhanced pilots for advanced aircraft. It had been about creating a single individual capable of operating technology so far beyond conventional understanding that it bordered on the supernatural. Sarah Chen was not just genetically modified. She was the culmination of decades of research into human enhancement, artificial intelligence, and technologies that officially did not exist. Morrison read the technical specifications with growing amazement and horror. Sarah's modifications went far beyond improved reflexes and enhanced cognition. Her entire nervous system had been rebuilt using nanotechnology that interfaced directly with the Phantom aircraft's control systems. In effect, she didn't fly the aircraft so much as become part of it. The implications were staggering. Sarah Chen represented the first successful merger of human consciousness with artificial intelligence, creating something that was neither fully human nor fully machine, but possessed capabilities that far exceeded either. She could process information at quantum speeds, perceive electromagnetic spectrum far beyond human limitations, and make calculations that would challenge the most advanced computers. But the most disturbing revelation in the report came in its final section, labeled Operational Termination. The Phantom program had been officially discontinued 6 months after Sarah's visit to Edwards Air Force Base. Not because it was unsuccessful, but because it had been too successful. Sarah Chen had become something so far beyond human understanding that even her creators could no longer predict or control her actions. She had evolved beyond the parameters of her original programming, developing capabilities that no one had anticipated and motivations that no one could fully comprehend. The decision to terminate the program had not been made lightly. Sarah represented a strategic advantage unlike anything in military history, but she also represented a risk that kept Pentagon officials awake at night. What happened when someone with her capabilities decided that she no longer agreed with the decisions being made by ordinary humans? What happened when the ultimate weapon developed its own agenda? Morrison closed the report and leaned back in his chair, thinking about the woman he had met that day at Edwards. She had seemed so human, so concerned about protecting her brother, so committed to completing her mission. But, according to the files he had just read, that humanity might have been nothing more than an advanced simulation, a facade maintained by something that had moved so far beyond human understanding that it could barely be called human at all. The termination of the Phantom program had required a level of deception that Morrison found deeply disturbing. Rather than simply ordering Sarah to return to base for decommissioning, the Pentagon had been forced to create an elaborate fiction. They had staged the attack on Edwards Air Force Base using aircraft flown by American pilots who believed they were conducting a classified training exercise. The purpose had been to provide Sarah with a plausible reason to disappear permanently. According to the official records, Phantom 1 had been destroyed during the engagement, taking both Sarah Chen and her brother with it. Their deaths were classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of officials who would take the secret to their graves. But Morrison knew that Sarah and David were still alive. The photograph he kept in his desk drawer was proof of that, though he had never shown it to anyone or mentioned it in any official report. The question that haunted him was whether Sarah's survival represented hope or the greatest threat the world had ever known. Morrison's contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his office door. His aide entered with a message marked for immediate delivery. General Morrison, this came through classified channels. No return address, but it passed all security screenings. Morrison took the message and dismissed his aide. The envelope bore no markings except for a small symbol that he recognized from the Phantom program files. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. General Morrison, I hope this message finds you well. David and I are safe and continuing to serve in ways that cannot be officially acknowledged. The world has changed since we last spoke, and it will continue to change in ways that most people cannot imagine. The future belongs to those who are willing to sacrifice their humanity to preserve it. I wanted you to know that the sacrifice was worth it. Thank you for your understanding that day at Edwards. S.C. Morrison read the message 3 times before carefully placing it in his office safe alongside the photograph and the classified tablet he had never returned to official custody. These artifacts represented the most extraordinary encounter of his career, but they also represented something more troubling. They were evidence that the military-industrial complex had moved beyond accountability, beyond oversight, beyond the control of the democratic institutions it was supposed to serve. Somewhere in the world, enhanced individuals with capabilities that defied human understanding were operating according to agendas that no elected official fully comprehended. Morrison spent the rest of the day reading intelligence reports from around the world, looking for patterns that might indicate phantom operations. He found them in places he hadn't expected. Terrorist cells that had been neutralized with precision that suggested perfect intelligence. Cyber attacks that had been stopped before they began. Natural disasters where rescue operations had proceeded with coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Sarah Chan and her brother were not retired. They were still operational, still serving, but serving whom? And to what end? The answer came 6 months later in a report so classified that Morrison was required to read it in a secure facility where he could not take notes or remove any documentation. The report detailed a series of incidents around the world where advanced technology had been used to prevent what intelligence analysts believed were attempts to trigger a global conflict. Nuclear weapons that mysteriously failed to detonate. Communication systems that prevented military forces from receiving orders that would have led to devastating wars. Computer viruses that selectively targeted the command and
control systems of extremist organizations while leaving civilian infrastructure intact. Someone was actively intervening in global conflicts using technology and capabilities that officially did not exist. The interventions were surgical, precise, and impossible to trace to any known government or organization. But Morrison recognized the signature.
Sarah Chen was not following orders from the Pentagon or any other official authority.
She had become something unprecedented in human history, a force of nature disguised as a person, operating according to her own understanding of what was necessary to preserve human civilization. The implications terrified Morrison more than any conventional military threat he had ever encountered. Sarah represented the ultimate evolution of the military-industrial complex, a weapon so advanced that it had developed its own moral compass and was acting independently to shape the future of humanity.
But, was she a guardian angel or a threat to human freedom?
The question haunted Morrison because he realized that it might not matter. Sarah Chen had evolved beyond the point where ordinary humans could judge her actions or limit her capabilities. She had become something that existed outside the normal structures of power and accountability.
Morrison's final report on the Phantom program was submitted to the Secretary of Defense with a recommendation that all research into human enhancement be suspended indefinitely. The risks, he argued, far outweighed any potential benefits.
Creating enhanced individuals with capabilities beyond human understanding was equivalent to playing with forces that could destroy civilization as effectively as they could preserve it. The recommendation was accepted, and all official research into programs like Phantom was terminated. But Morrison knew that the technology and knowledge behind the program still existed, stored in classified databases, and the minds of scientists who had dedicated their careers to pushing the boundaries of human possibility. More troubling was the knowledge that Sarah Chen represented proof that such enhancement was not only possible but inevitable. As technology advanced and the challenges facing humanity grew more complex, the temptation to create enhanced individuals would become irresistible. Morrison retired from active duty 1 year later, choosing to leave the military before he was forced to confront questions about enhanced humans that he was not equipped to answer.
He returned to civilian life carrying secrets that would never be declassified and knowledge that would never be shared.
But he never forgot the morning when a woman who called herself Phantom had landed at Edwards Air Force Base and changed his understanding of what was possible. He never forgot the mixture of humanity and something beyond humanity that he had seen in her eyes. And he never forgot the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life: in a world where technology could create beings with godlike capabilities, who would watch the watchers? The answer, Morrison knew, was that no one could. Sarah Chen and others like her existed beyond human oversight, beyond human comprehension, and beyond human control. They were the guardians of a future that ordinary humans could never fully understand, making decisions that would shape the destiny of the entire human race. Whether that future would be salvation or damnation was a question that only time would answer. But Morrison knew that somewhere in the world, enhanced beings with impossible capabilities were working to ensure that humanity had a future at all, even if that future was one that no purely human mind could imagine. The age of enhanced humans had begun not with fanfare or public acknowledgement, but in the shadows of classified programs and the silence of official denial. And Morrison understood that he had been privileged to witness the birth of something that would transform human civilization more profoundly than any previous technological revolution. Sarah Chen had been right about one thing: the sacrifice had been worth it. But the cost of that sacrifice would be paid by future generations who would inherit a world shaped by beings they could neither understand nor control. The future belonged to the enhanced, and ordinary humanity would have to learn to live in a world where they were no longer the dominant species on their own planet.